So we might talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes and then do questions. Would that work? So you're a biologist, you're a scientist, and you work in the field of science. And I would expect a book by a biologist to be about baboons and botflies and barnacles, you know. So why are you interested in writing about religion, of all things?
Yeah, well, the two books are connected to one another. I think in the same philosophical and psychological way that Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene and Blind Watchmaker are connected to the God delusion. So what happens is you start off as an evolutionary biologist. It's probably worse in your state than mine, which was Maryland when I started teaching this, and then you write a book about the evidence for evolution, which is incontrovertible. I mean, if you're a scientist, the evidence is so strong that you can't deny it without being considered perverted or maybe blinkered. And then you go out on book tours and you get pushback. In fact, being an evolutionary biologist is the only form of being a scientist where half of your fellow Americans don't believe a word of what you're saying. So you invariably encounter, you can hear me okay? You invariably encounter pushback from people. The latest statistics from the Gallup poll are 43% of Americans are young Earth creationists, and another 30% are theistic evolutionists, which means they think that evolution happened, but God tweaked it in some way or another, invariably leading to humans as the sort of pinnacle of evolution. So you wonder, as I did, why so much pushback from people? Why is there so much resistance to a scientific concept which has so much evidence behind it, like the germ theory of disease, that it's incontrovertible? And then you realize, of course, and nobody can deny this, that all the opposition to evolution in this country and elsewhere in the world comes from one source, which is religion. There's no reason to reject the evidence for evolution unless you have some kind of biblical alternative. So you start realizing that, yeah, religion can really blinker people against scientific truth. And then I started to wonder, well, why? Why does it do that? I mean, can't they be compatible with one another, as many people maintain? What is there about religion that makes people so resistant to science? And then I started reading theology. That was about the death of me. You've done that, right? And Dan's famous for having said, at least in my circles, theology is the study of, is a subject without an object, which it is. So I started reading theology for 2.5 years. And when a scientist is plunged into the world of theology, it's a completely alien world because it's sort of familiar. There are truth statements about what is true in the cosmos: heaven, hell, God, angels, moral codes, demons, depending on the religion. And yet there's no way to verify those truth statements, which is why we have 50, 60,000 different religions in the state. So you have this sort of parallel universe of science and religion, both making statements about what is true in the universe. Granted, they're about different things. But one of the areas, religion has no way to verify whether its truth statements are true, which is why, of course, we have so many religions. And then science does. So there's only one science and there's 50, 60,000.
Yeah, but you understand
religions.
that when I was a minister, the bedrock of truth was the Bible. It was revealed truth to us. So what the Bible says, either literally or metaphorically in some degree, is our standard for truth. So you can understand why so many people resist something which appears... Hello? Not working? 1, 2, 3. Can you turn up this mic? Can you hear better now? Oh. I pushed a button.
No.
Ah. It's a miracle. So when I was a minister, the axiom is that the Bible is the revealed truth. So you can understand why so many people who grow up with this idea that there is an absolute revealed truth and that everything must conform to, when something seems not to conform to that word, like the book of Genesis, well then it must be wrong in some way. So that's what you're battling, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm battling the fact that that there are two parallel ways of looking at the universe, both of which have at their ground, and you have admitted this to me before, fact statements. There are those liberal people, religious believers and theologians who say, we don't really care about literal truth. It's all about communality and sociality and singing the hymns and feeling at one with the universe. We don't care about, and we don't make statements that's true. But the honest theologians say, well, yeah, I mean, and the Bible says it too, something like, if Christ be not crucified, then our faith is in vain.
Be not risen, yeah.
Be not risen, our faith is in vain. I can't. You can quote the book on that, I'm sure. And so there it is, right in the Bible, saying that, you know, what use is religion unless it's based on epistemic statements about the world? So this is a long-winded way of writing this, but that's the pathway from evolution and trying to understand why people reject it to a book which says that science and religion are incompatible. It's the parallel universe view that religion is in some ways a pseudoscience. It makes statements about what's true, but it has no way to verify them. And then when it's challenged, it uses many of the same subterfuges and tactics that other pseudosciences like homeopathy, crystal therapy, and ufology make.
So I want to talk about incompatibility, but first you mentioned these theistic evolutionists. And I went through a phase of theistic evolution, meaning that I accepted the fact of evolution, because how can you not? It's an undeniable fact, which raises the questions about Adam and Eve. But I remember going through a phase of thinking, okay, well, there's a God, and he created everything, because it has to be a God, and he had to create everything. But who am I to dictate to God how he could not have created the universe? That this all-powerful God, you could do it anyway except evolution, not evolution, right? So there are a lot of believers who think evolution is beautiful because it's this weird kind of godlike, mysterious way that he created the universe. How do you talk to those people?
Yeah, I call that the V8 theory of theistic evolution. For 2 millennia, religious people rejected the idea that Genesis was not true. And then Darwin came along and blew it out of the water in 1859, and there's 2 ways to deal with that. I mean, even in Darwin's day, the facts were so strong, and the guy was so smart in his book, The Origin of Species, that you'd have to be pretty blinkered to reject evolution. So there's 2 ways to deal with it. First of all, you keep rejecting it and just saying, well, there's got to be something wrong with the data, which is what the creationists do. The other way is to take evolution on board and still believe in God, which is the theistic evolution, and somehow rationalize the fact that evolution is really the way that God would have done it. And, I mean, this is what I call the V8 theory. You say, wow, why didn't I realize that at all? And my reaction to that is severalfold. First of all, it's not in the Bible. So, if the Bible is the revealed word of God, why didn't it say, well, humans evolved, humans developed gradually over a period of millions of years from simpler creatures? Why didn't God tell us that?
Well, I would have said he did, because Adam was made from the dust. And remember when Adam was cursed in the Garden of Eden, unto dust you will return. So the God of that version of creation was admitting that Adam was a biological creature made from physical organisms. And in there's no talk of heaven or hell or afterlife. It's just from dust to dust, basically. But
you'd have to stretch evolution pretty far to think that humans evolved in a macro-mutational leap from dust.
Well,
and also, I think at least in one of the 2 stories of Genesis, the animals came after humans, right? So
there's different orders in God's creation.
So I think the theistic evolutionists, as Desi Arnaz said, and I Love Lucy, they have a lot of splaining to do. Why would God do it this way? Natural selection is a horrible, tortuous process which involves the death of many animals and many lineages. 99.9% of all the species that ever lived on this planet went extinct without leaving descendants. So I think it's incumbent on theologians or people who are theistic evolutionists to explain why God did it that way. And if they say, well, God's ways are mysterious, we don't know why God did it that way, which is what they do, then you say, well, how do you know anything about God then, if his ways are so mysterious? How do you even know he's good? How do you know he wants us to not kill people? You can't not know about God in some ways and not other ways and just pick and choose based on what's convenient for your theology. So there's a lot of problems with theistic evolution. The way people rationalize it is that it's more creative than,
they just pop into existence.
Yeah, that's the post facto rationalization. This is what theologians are really good at, making stuff up that doesn't comport with what they had believed before. And so they say, well, it's much more creative than having God just bring everything into existence. But, I defy any scientific fact to elude a good theological explanation. They're really good at making stuff up. So
I could make up some right now, but let's talk about your book.
Okay.
Okay, so you mentioned creation. What are some of the problems with the Adam and Eve story from a scientific point of view? The first human, the first man, first woman, 6 to 10 or whatever thousand years ago?
Yeah, well, assuming if you're a young Earth creationist, which probably most creationists are, that the Earth is 6 to 10,000 years old, there's that problem right off the bat, that we have fossils that are dated without any doubt of our ancestors, and we have a sequence of fossils that, granted, we have not been able to put them into an unequivocally universally accepted line of descent, but we see Australopithecus afarensis 4 to 5 million years ago, and a lineage progressing towards modern human type. So clearly, 6 to 10,000 years ago, there were already civilizations on this planet. Humans didn't come into existence then. The main problem for theologians now with Adam and Eve is that population genetics, which is my field. And what it has done in the last 5 to 10 years is develop methods in which we can actually look back over the history of the human genome and see, well, how many humans lived at different periods of time? And we could do that by looking at the amount of genetic variation. I mean, there's genes like the ABO blood group where, we have the A, B, and O forms, 3 forms of a gene, but there's lots of genes which have many different forms. And using that data, we can calculate, and with assumptions about mutation rates and other things, we can calculate how big the human species was at different points in time. And so you can go back like 5 to 6 million years and get reasonable estimates. Now, if the Adam and Eve theory were true, we see a population size of 2, 6 to 10,000 years ago, which means we'd have a very limited pool of genetic variation in the human species today, which we don't see. So using reasonable estimates, they've calculated that the number of humans at its minimum, we went through 2 bottlenecks. The most severe one was about 60,000 years ago when humans left Africa. The group of humans that left Africa had a minimum size of 2,250, and the people that stayed in Africa had a minimum size of 10,000. So the smallest that the human population could ever have been was 12,250. And as you know, you don't have to do the math, that's greater than 2. So, and it's greater than the 8 that was on Noah's Ark. So,
but it's tiny. I mean, that's a tiny population.
It's tiny. Oh yeah, it's tiny. And we still don't, we understand why the human population in Africa was small, because there's only a small group that ventured out of its homeland into the Middle East. We don't know what happened in Africa to reduce the population down to 10,000, 60,000 years ago. Could have been a plague or, something like that.
A holy war, maybe.
Yeah. But the unequivocal fact is it was never 2. And that means that Adam and Eve could not have been the literal genetic forebears of all humanity. Now you may think, okay, so what? It's all metaphors anyway. But for a lot of people, that's not metaphorical. I mean, you explained to me that when you were a preacher that it was, for many people.
Because God doesn't lie, and He didn't say it was a parable. He didn't say
that's
it was.
Right.
If there's Adam and an Eve, they have names. And so God tells the truth, and the Bible says it, therefore that has to be truth. Otherwise, it undermines your whole, as a believer, I thought it undermined my whole basis for morality and for knowledge and for epistemology if I didn't have some solid rock to build on. Mm-hmm. So it's a very uneasy thing to contemplate, that perhaps the people who wrote those ancient books were just kind of making stuff up,
Which they were, of course, at least in our view. Yeah. But theologians, of course, have dealt with this in a number of ways. Some of them simply reject the calculations, which isn't really kosher because they're very conservative calculations. The more creative way, which is what theologians are good at, and God knows how far advanced we'd be scientifically if all the brain power that was devoted to theological rationalization was used in science. But they make up a number of stories. Well, Adam and Eve is a metaphor, right? But then, a metaphor for what? Were they a metaphor? What is the original sin then? What does that become? If there's actually 12,000 people, but 2 of them bore the original sin. How did it get to everybody else? So there's like, in the book you can read this. I don't want to give a lot of it away, but there's ways that theologians have rationalized this figure of 12,500 people with 2. One of which is to say, well, Adam and Eve were the titular heads of humanity. That is, God appointed 2 Neolithic farmers to be the sort of honorary ancestors of all humans. It's almost funny. I mean, if you're not religious, you will find this amusing because it shows how creative the theological mind can be. But then that has its own problems, because how did those 2 titular ancestors spread original sin to everybody else? And what is original sin? Is it just a metaphor for our evolved nature of being xenophobic and aggressive, which some theologians have said? If that's true, then it has its own problems. Well, if God knew that we were going to evolve into a xenophobic and aggressive species, then original sin is not a choice. It's something that was built into theistic evolution. The last thing I want to say, and I'm sorry to go on so long, is that the Roman Catholic Church still holds the doctrine that Adam and Eve are the literal ancestors of humanity. So when you hear the Roman Catholic Church say, we're down with evolution, we have no problem with it, just remember that in the encyclical De Humani Generis, if that's the pronunciation, by Pope Pius XII, I think, says you cannot not believe in Adam and Eve as the literal ancestors of humanity. So the Catholic dogma is really at strong odds with Adam and Eve, with the scientific data, and they haven't explained themselves yet.
That titular head idea does explain, or can explain, where Cain and Abel got their wives, at least. There were other, it wasn't just, it wasn't some incest thing, there were actually other people around there.
Yeah, so. From the land of Nod, is that where they? Yeah, I've never really understood how theologians get around. I mean, if Adam and Eve were the heads of all humanity, what were those people doing in Nod?
Neanderthals, maybe, who knows. So, and besides that, even if there wasn't Adam and Eve, they would not have come out of a garden in the Middle East. They would have come out of Africa. We know that we all came out of Africa, basically. They would have been Africans.
True.
Okay, so your book is titled Faith versus Fact. And that word versus makes it look like they're in opposition. And I'm pretty sure, and you say they're incompatible.
Yeah.
So maybe define the word fact as a scientist or even as a philosopher. How would you? What does the word fact actually mean?
Yeah, well, I knew that people were going to get after me about definitions. There's some I have to define: incompatible, faith, fact, and also religion. Trying to define religion is like nailing Jello to the wall. There's always a group of people that are going to harass you if you get it wrong. Like, what about the Jains? What about the Buddhists, et cetera? So I resorted to the Oxford English Dictionary. I just said I'm going to use the OED as my source for all definitions. That way, if you don't like what I say, take it up with the OED. So, so what was the word you asked me?
Fact.
Fact is just what exists in the universe. I mean, you can see it in the book. I have the actual definitions written down, but it's a fact that we're sitting here on stage. It's something that is empirically checkable and verifiable, and all rational people will agree with it, more or less. I mean, that's not the word-for-word definition, but that's more or less how I use it.
And you have a big section in the book about those who attempt to either integrate or accommodate religion, integrate both kind of equal, or scientists who want to accommodate religion into their worldview. So don't you think as a scientist or even as a historian, all fact claims are really probabilistic? You get to a certain level of confidence and you say, yeah, 98, 99, 99 point, we're going to go with it. But there's always a slight possibility. We have to say there's a slight possibility that we might be wrong about anything. So when I was a preacher, I would have said, yeah, well, everybody has to make some kind of a leap of faith beyond, even quantum mechanics, which is 99.9999999, whatever, a hair's breadth between LA and New York. You're still making a tiny leap to say, okay, and our confidence level justifies us rounding up to calling it a fact, right? So when I was a believer, I would have thought, well, there's some evidence for God and for Christianity. There's the empty tomb of Jesus, and there's documents, right? They exist. There's evidence that you might quibble about how the quality of that evidence, but there is some evidence. There's testimonies of healings and of changed lives. There's testimonies of inner feelings of peace and knowing God. There's all this kind of maybe lower level, maybe 40, 50, 60%, wherever you would put that. So if you scientists are justified in making your leap of faith beyond 100% level of confidence, why can't we believers also make make a leap of faith from a platform that maybe isn't 100%?
That's a very good question. And let me agree with Dan, which he's correct, that science, unlike religion, does not see truth as absolute. So when I say what is, what I meant is what is that all rational people, or almost all rational people, would agree what is. Like if I said there's a bottle of water here, almost all rational people agree with that. We would call it a fact. Something that it's not absolutely certain. We could all be deceived. This could be a hologram that they're projecting from backstage, for example. But within reason, this is a bottle of water sitting here. And scientific truth is like that. There's always a chance. And in my book, the first book, Why Evolution is True, where I say it's true, I say also it didn't have to be true. And here's some possible observations that will show evolution could be false. And this is what we need to look for. So whenever you're a scientist and you're doing work, you're always saying, well, what could prove me wrong? What we mean by truth is things that are so certain that you would bet your life savings on it, more or less, okay? That doesn't mean it's absolutely true, but I would bet my life savings that this is a bottle of water and not a hologram. Or that the formula for a molecule of water is H2O.
You have a life savings. I mean, that's an accomplishment right there.
Okay, by now I've forgotten your question. Oh, so why is that a leap of faith?
A leap of faith.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure it's a leap of faith to trust your senses. And, philosophically, you cannot justify the scientific method a priori. I'll admit that right off the bat. You can't say that we're going to get to the truth about the universe by using this series of methods of having experimentation, observation, replication, doubt, etc. The method is justified by the fact that it works and that it cures diseases, and we can land probes on meteorites. And so, this works. Theology does not work. The reason it doesn't work is what I mentioned before. We have one science, and everybody that engages in this so-called leap of faith winds up, if you're rational, accepting the same conclusion. The formula of water is H2O. The Earth goes around the sun. Benzene has 6 carbon atoms in it. The DNA is a double helix. With religion, you could say, well, there's evidence. But boy, that's not the kind of evidence that a scientist... the empty tomb, first of all. Where is that damn empty tomb? They haven't found it yet, right? It's only written down in Scripture. Right?
Yeah, Gospels.
And the feelings of religion that you get, well, you can get a revelation, say, from Jesus. But over in Saudi Arabia, there's people getting revelations from Allah or Muhammad. So the fact is that the religious way of knowing, the religious leap of faith, has not converged on any unanimity about what's true in the universe. It doesn't work. So I would claim that we don't know anything more about the divine, including whether or not gods exist, than people did 2,000 years ago. We haven't converged on any set of universally accepted truths about nature from religion, but we have about science. And that goes to the heart of my book, that the scientific way of finding things out is absolutely incompatible with the so-called religious way of finding things out.
Okay, so accommodation. How can faith, in fact, be incompatible if there are indeed scientists who believe in God?
Yeah, that's the very good question. It's one I get very common. And it depends on your definition of compatibility. So the most common way that people will claim that science and religion are compatible is, besides the Gouldian thing, which we should probably talk about later, is that there are religious scientists. And in fact, the most famous scientist in the United States, Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institutes of Health, is an evangelical Christian. And there are many others as well. Probably about 30 to 40% of scientists in America are religious. But by the way, that's a lot lower than the average number of Americans that are religious in this country, which is at least 85% at a minimum. So what do you do about these scientists who believe in God? Doesn't that show they're compatible? And my answer is this, that it shows people's remarkable ability to compartmentalize. It doesn't show compatibility, it shows compartmentalization. When you if you're Francis Collins and you walk into the genetics lab, he was head of the Human Genome Project, you put aside all your beliefs about God. You put aside the assumption that the divine could be affecting your results, or that an understanding of God the way he does could guide his practice. Scientists operate as atheists, materialists and naturalists. When they go through the church, there's this remarkable transformation that happens. For a Catholic, it's that the wafer and the wine that you eat is the body and blood of Christ, not just figuratively, but literally. you believe all these superstitious things for which there is not a jot of evidence at all. And to me, I don't see how that's compatibility at all. It shows the remarkable ability of humans to compartmentalize the way they look at the world. I used an example of this the other day. Lynn Margulis, who is a very, very famous scientist, she discovered something about the cell, which I won't get into. She was really good, but she had this side of her, she was a 9/11 truther. She thought the US government flew those planes into the World Trade Center. And so, you know, she was a woo-meister and a scientist at the same time. And the example, which is really invidious, but I have to use it anyway, is that the child molestation by the Catholic Church, a lot of those priests didn't think they were doing anything wrong. So at the same time, they held the view that Catholicism was okay, but it was okay to molest children. Now, does that show that pedophilia and Catholicism are compatible? No, it shows this ability of humans to have this cognitive dissonance and live with it. So, you know, I don't think the existence of religious scientists shows anything more than somebody that seems rational but has a side of them that they believe in UFOs or 9/11 or that Obama was born in, you know, as a Muslim.
Then there are those scientists who are non-religious, pure naturalists, who, like Stephen Jay Gould, said that we can still accommodate religion because science is talking about one sphere of the natural world, and religion is talking about something totally different. He called it NOMA, the non-overlapping magisteria, and you talk about that in your book.
Yeah.
So what do you say to people like Stephen Gould and others who think that morality and meaning and beauty and aesthetics all come from this other magisteria, and science is over here, they don't touch, so they're not necessarily integrated, but they're not in conflict either?
Yeah, that is the most common way that people try to claim the compatibility of science and religion, that they deal with completely separate areas. The purview of science is the real world, the cosmos, and the realm of naturalism, materialism. As you said, religion is the sphere of meaning, morals, and values, as Gould called it. Well, there's two problems with that, one on either side, which is, first of all, as I tried to emphasize at the beginning, science is, let me back up. Religion is not devoid of statements about what reality. If you survey Americans, for example, and you ask them, does God exist? Does heaven exist? Does hell exist? Do angels exist? Is there an afterlife? Anywhere between 70 and 85% of Americans will say yes on any one of those questions. So religions at bottom, with very few exceptions, are based on epistemic statements about the world. If Christ be not risen, our faith is in vain. That is showing how, at bottom, regardless of the moral truths, regardless of the communality you feel with people in church, your religion is really groundless without statements about how the universe is. And I have a big section in my book with quote after quote after quote after quote by theologians, liberal ones too, who say Gould's just dead wrong. Our religion is founded on statements about what's real in the cosmos, and we're not going to have any of this NOMA stuff. And I had many quotes because there's so many people that claim, religious people don't think that their religion is founded on truth statements. So in general, the most strongest opponents for this kind of reconciliation have not been scientists, but theologians and religious people, because they recognize that religion is more than just a series of values. Now, getting to the values thing, I'm an atheist, you're an atheist, we're not immoral, I don't think we've killed or brutalized anybody. There's a whole history of meaning, values, and morals, investigation of those areas from secular philosophers that have nothing to do with God. Hume, Kant, Spinoza, Mill, in our own day, John Rawls, Peter Singer, Anthony Grayling, that show that you can investigate and make meaningful statements about morality without having any relationship to God at all. I mean, the Euthyphro argument of Plato, which I won't go into here, you can look it up on Wikipedia, disposes of the idea that religion can be a source of morality. God cannot tell us what's right or wrong. He can only instantiate what we think is right and wrong from previous extra-biblical experience, evolution, cultural observation, and so on and so on. So, religion can be a source, a repository of meaning, morals, and values, as your preacher tells you every Sunday, but God himself cannot be, on philosophical grounds, a source of those kinds of ethics.
a lot of people go to church and worship in or out of church, and they get this feeling of meaning and transcendence, and their life is elevated, their higher values. They're not just thinking about the mundane world. It gives comfort to a lot of people. It gives a feeling of peace to a lot of people. So are you suggesting we should take that away from believers, or that what they have, non-believers don't lack?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I prefer that you would answer that, but I know I'm supposed to answer it because you have a lifetime of dealing with that question. If that's all religion did, gave comfort to people, I would be a lot less opposed to it. But the fact is that it doesn't just do that. It not only gives comfort to people, it terrorizes people. I've met many ex-Catholics, for example, that are still psychologically damaged their whole lives with the feeling of guilt that was instilled in them. Also, if you knew that you weren't going to heaven or hell, or if you had strong doubts about it, about the afterlife, your life might be different. I mean, knowing the truth to me is, or at least having doubts about things that you should have doubts about, is always better than believing in something for which there's no evidence. So in the book, I talk about, is it ever good to have faith when there's no evidence for it? And I could only think of one scenario in which it was true. I'm not going to tell you what that is. You can buy the book. But religion, I'm against it on philosophical grounds because I'm a scientist. And I have this belief that knowing the truth is always better than not knowing the truth. And then once you know what the truth is, then you go and set your life up appropriately. If you know that you're not going to heaven and you're not going to live forever, then you might behave in a different way. Then you might live your life in a different way. I know I do, I was religious when I was younger. But it's more than that. I mean, religion is not just a source of comfort, it's a source of divisiveness. And that's where I get, upset about it. Look what's happening in the Middle East now. Not just between Muslims and non-Muslims, but between Shia and Sunni. What is that argument about? It's an epistemic argument. Who does Allah want to be the successor of Muhammad? Is it his relatives or his appointed minions? And because of that question, which can't be resolved, they're killing each other, and they've been killing each other for 1,500 years. So, look, in this country, the fight between Republicans and Democrats about abortion, about women's rights, it extends into every area of sphere. It's just my view that religion may provide a source of comfort, but also provides moral codes, which in general are much worse than the kind of moral code you could get from secular reason. And so, in general, I would conclude that a world without religion, as John Lennon said, would be a world that would be better than the one we have now.
So we would have a higher confidence in our fact claims. You basically in your book are comparing, I guess, two different epistemologies. One of them which is subject to verification and falsifiability and evidence and testing, and a humbleness and a willingness to admit that you might be wrong and to change your mind. And another one which is apparently not subject to much of that at all.
Well, some of it, we just talked about Adam and Eve, right? There's a lot of stuff in the Bible which science has disproven. The Exodus is another one.
Or the Mormon idea that, I'm a member of a Native American tribe. My dad's a Delaware Indian. And I had a Mormon tell me that I'm descended from ancient Israelites, which is what the Mormons teach.
Yeah, that's in the Book of Mormon.
Which you can test, right?
Right. The Book of Mormon says that the tribes that populated, the Native Americans that populated North America came from the Middle East. Well, that makes a prediction that's testable. You look at the genetics of Native Americans and you look at the genetics of people in the Middle East. When you do that, you find, no way. The Native Americans came from Siberians who crossed the Bering Straits about 20 to 15,000 years ago. And so the genetic similarity is so much stronger between Native Americans and Siberians, people from Eastern Asia, than it is between people in the Middle East, that you cannot maintain what the Book of Mormon says. So, of course, the Mormon theologians are in the same bind that the Adam and Evers are in. How do they deal with this supposition? And it's laughable. They say, well, the original Native Americans were all wiped out and replaced by a second set of Native Americans. Not us, but by the Native Americans that are there and the Hispanics. Or they'll say that the invasion of people from the Middle East didn't happen in North America, it happened in Belize, for example. Well, that doesn't work either, because you go to Belize and it's the same kind of thing. So
they could have just simply said, my bad, you know. They could have just admitted, we made it, you know, our leaders goofed, they made a mistake. The writers of the Bible goofed, they made mistakes. Humans goof all the time. Human beings are making mistakes all the time. So what made those supposed religious authorities exempt from that human tendency to exaggerate? And
yeah, but you know the problem with that, because once you admit that parts of the Bible are wrong, that's a slippery slope, because then it could all be wrong. I mean, ultimately, if Adam and Eve are metaphors, then Jesus died for a metaphor. And that doesn't sit well with many Christians. And then, what keeps you from saying that that Jesus himself was a metaphor, just for maybe a spiritual rebirth? I mean, the evidence for Jesus, we won't get into this because it's very contentious, is very thin. There is no evidence for the existence of a Jesus person, in my view, beyond what's written in the scriptures. And that's pretty thin. There should have been, because there were plenty of historians writing in the Middle East at that time, and yet nobody mentions Jesus.
you mean contemporary? Because in the second, late first and second, there are some references to a Christ. Not a Jesus, but a Christ, but yeah.
In the where?
2nd century.
Oh yeah, but so a lot of those are taken from secondhand from other people.
But that is some kind of evidence. I mean, it is something, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you count what's written in a book as evidence, sorry, how much time do we have, John?
We've got about 20 minutes.
Oh, okay. So we'll start taking questions. All right, I'll just say this then, that the evidence that's used, the material evidence that's used to support the biblical narrative or the Muhammad narrative is extremely weak compared to the kind of evidence used to support the existence of evolution, atoms, or infectious microorganisms. So no scientist would look at a single book and say, this book, for which there's ample evidence, it was confected by various people over a number of centuries, tells us the absolute truth about what happened. We have to look elsewhere. When you look elsewhere, you get nothing. So you know, and religious people want evidence. It's not that they're impervious to evidence. That's why there's expeditions up Mount Ararat every year looking for the remains of Noah's Ark. If they found an old wooden boat up there, you can believe that would be on every newspaper in the world. The Bible vindicated, you know. People think they can find Jesus' house in Jerusalem. That was just in the Daily Mirror a couple of months ago. Didn't, I mean, the evidence was thin. So religious people would like the evidence to buttress their faith. It's not that they say we don't need no stinking evidence. It's just that it isn't there. And that's really the difference between the leap of faith in religion, which is huge, and the leap of faith in science, which is virtually non-existent.
So let's do questions.
Let's start some questions, and so raise your hand, I'll come around to you. Okay. And let's make them questions, not statements.
Now, no preaching.
You said that the evidence for Jesus was existence of other species, but then you mentioned Muhammad. Is Muhammad's existence questionable?
It is actually, and you know, I don't want to pronounce on that. So in case you didn't hear him, he said, is Muhammad just as dubious as a historical personage as Jesus was? And some people claim yes, it is, but I haven't read enough about that to give any kind of informed opinion. Just be aware that there is a controversy about whether Muhammad actually existed or not.
There is a book by Ibn Warraq.
Okay.
Did Muhammad exist?
What's his conclusion?
He's a former Muslim himself. His conclusion, of course, like with all historical claims, is that the probability is very low. Mm-hmm. It's not zero.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Years ago, I was in it was a religious class, and I got into a discussion with the guy. He said that he was a computer science major in college, and that he knew how to initialize a program such that it looked like it already had a history. And so that was his way of rationalizing the difference between what we know as the age of the earth and what the Bible says is the age of the earth. And so I'm just curious, how would you respond to that?
Well, okay, I think you're probably referring to the fact that the earth looks old because God made it to look old. Right, and there's another ancillary to that, which is, why do we see light from stars that are 3 billion years away if the Earth is only 6,000 years old? That light has to have left that star 3 billion years ago. And the theologians say, well, God created the light in transit. Otherwise, if he hadn't done that, we couldn't see the damn stars. Well, you know, if you have that view of God, that he made the Earth to look old in so many different ways, and yet they all I mean, the moon is as old as the Earth is, and we can date the moon, we can date the oldest rocks on Earth, and they're pretty close to each other. We can date fossils and use radiometric dating in many ways, all of which give the same date. If you believe that God made the world that way, even though it's only 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, then you're believing in a God that's a trickster God, that is deliberately deceiving humans. And A lot of people don't like to think that their God is like that. And B, why did he do it that way? Why did he give us brains to figure this stuff out and then delude us? So theologians, as usual, they're always attacking atheists for their scientific conclusions, but they seem to be impervious to questions like this, like, why did God do things that way? And then they'll just throw up their hands and say, God's ways are mysterious. Well, if you have that, point of view, then you've made yourself immune to any kind of reason whatsoever.
Do y'all look at each other and just think that you're a bunch of molecules talking to each other?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, we're a highly rarefied, evolved group of molecules that have the ability to use syntactical language, but yeah, there's no evidence to the contrary.
You had brought up people going on Ararat looking for Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
Are there any other, I know there are, but major problems you could point out with the idea of a boat of that size, every species being...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, everybody knows the problems. There's a pamphlet you can buy called The Incredible Voyage of Noah's Ark. I mean, how many species are there on Earth? 7 million at minimum. So you have 2 of each of them except for the clean ones, right? And then you have seven of those. So multiply it out and do the math. There's going to be, 50, 60 million animals on the Ark. It couldn't possibly have floated. How do you feed them? What do you do with the poop? And what about the animals in the sea? Then you have a boiling, fermenting, sediment-laden, churning water underneath the Ark. I mean, if God didn't put the whales on the Ark, and how could he do that? Then they must have been below it, but they couldn't have survived in that kind of climate. So, there's ways that theologians get around this, of course. The most recent one I've read is that God made all the animals miniature. So they can, you laugh, but this is serious theology. There are people that spend their lives and get good money, paid good money to do this kind of stuff. And as a scientist, it sort of offends me. These are not dumb people, by the way. Theologians are smart people that have somehow, I don't know, Dan, why they've gone down this route or not, but somehow they've used this brain power to rationalize falsehoods.
It's amazing. Okay. Theory of evolution by Darwin, of course. My question is, who created evolution?
Could you speak up a bit?
Evolution.
Yeah.
The thing about evolution.
Yes.
Okay. Darwin has this theory about evolution, how living things transform. Who created those things?
Who created what?
Evolution.
Oh, evolution happened by itself. It's the same way as if you make rock candy and you make a supersaturated solution of sugar and you put a string in there. You're going to get these crystals of sugar. That's how they make rock candy. That's how evolution started. You have chemicals floating around. We don't exactly know how it happened, but you have a chemical evolution which creates these complicated molecules, and eventually that sort of segues gradually. And again, I emphasize that we don't understand how it happened yet. I think we will someday, maybe. It becomes the first self-replicating molecule. And once you get that, then evolution is inevitable. So once you get life, then you have evolution. That's almost by definition true. So.
I'm trying to understand your theory here to get some kind of understanding what you're saying. You said evolution created itself. Have anybody ever been in cooking? Okay. Have you ever cooked anything?
You're supposed to ask questions and not preach. So.
I'm gonna do that. Okay. If you put something and try to cook it, you can't just let it sit.
Sorry, I can't hear you at all.
If you cook something, you can't put something in a pot and just say, okay, cook itself. It don't work like that.
Yeah, but that's not the way we think it worked, okay? It worked under conditions which no longer obtain on this planet. life evolved probably about 3.6 billion years ago when there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, when there was volcanic activity and lightnings, when we probably had a lot of undersea activity. And so to say that we can't make life today is completely ludicrous as a way of ruling out the origin of life 3.5 billion years ago.
Hi, I read a book probably about 10 years ago, and I hope I'm not misremembering the name, by a sociologist by the name of Rodney Stark. And he did a book on religion, and he was actually kind of a bystander in the whole debate about it, but he predicted through a very logical model that religion will, fortunately or unfortunately, always be with us because of unlimited knowledge. Do you agree with that? Do you think religion, we will ever reach a point where we do away with religious institutions and everything becomes kind of individual spirituality?
Well, I have my own views on that, but I think it's a question that Dan might want to answer, because he spends his life trying to get rid of religion. So.
Well, if you redefine it like you did earlier as a place for community and meaning and value and morals and music and all that, well, we'll probably always have that. Call it religion or not. We're social animals, and we want to get together to have these, I guess, elevated times with each other. So that probably will never die out. But look at Europe. Most Europeans today are thoroughly secular. They've got these gorgeous empty churches over there, but just from bottom up, they have pretty much become less and less religious, and it's not bothering them at all. There are tribes. Daniel Everett in the Amazon found a tribe that has no afterlife, no God, no religion, no beliefs, no magic. They're just happy atheists, and they didn't automatically come up with religion on their own. So maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's a bell curve thing. Some humans will and some won't.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just say my answer to the question of, I agree. I think there'll always be people that believe in God, and there'll always be need for communality. But religion, in the sense that we know it, is on the way out. I mean, and it's on the way out in the U.S. because of the statistics. It's almost on the way out in Europe, where Scandinavia, as Dan said, is a largely atheistic area. And I point out, by the way, that Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, which are largely atheistic countries, are, if anything, more moral than the United States. So that shows you don't need religion and you don't need God to behave properly, to have a good society and be moral.
Right here.
Mm-hmm.
So you implied that the world would be better without religion.
So you got to speak up. My hearing's not
You
substandard.
implied the world would be better without religion.
That's my opinion. Yes.
So my question is, do you think that your life has a meaning, or is that even important to you?
Yeah, I do think my life has meaning. I think what you're getting at is, without religion, life loses meaning. And that would only obtain if you think that the meaning of your life was somehow given to you by God. But I don't believe that. And I know it to be true for myself, and I think Dan for himself. If you ask an atheist if their lives lack meaning, they're not going to say, no, ever since I gave up God, I've just felt like I had no meaning or purpose in life. It's just doesn't work that way. The fact is that except for the really hyper-religious people, like Orthodox Jews, or really extremist Muslims, or Mormons that live in communes, most people that see the meaning of their lives in their family, their friends, their loved ones, their avocations, their hobbies, those things like that, even though they may say that it's God that gives their life meanings. So when you give up God, you're giving up one source of so-called meaning to your life that really isn't a major one for most of the people on this planet. There is no external meaning I see in people's lives. You imbue your life with its own meaning and live your life that way. And I believe that most people, probably in this room, do that too. So.
Maybe I could plug my last book. It's called Life-Driven Purpose.
Oh yeah, it's a good book. Yeah. That's of course a parody of Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life. It's a really good book, by the way. I'd recommend it. So.
Really quickly, earlier at the first part of the lecture, you mentioned one of the things that you mentioned was convincing about religion is on the issue of evolution, that the burden's on theists to explain why God would have chosen that particular way rather than some other way. Couldn't you argue that in order to have morality, you have to have a the universe operates according to laws, because if
So you have to have a universal what?
that operates according to laws, and that if the universe were just random, then there wouldn't be any morality, because there wouldn't be any consequences to the actions, theoretically.
Well, there are consequences to our actions, right? Even in a universe that operates purely materialistically like ours does, right? If I kill somebody, it's going to have bad effects on their family and welfare, right?
Exactly, but what I'm saying is, from a theistic perspective, I mean, why wouldn't you say that? You mentioned earlier the burden's on us to explain why wouldn't God choose a different way. Well, couldn't it be to say, well, wouldn't you expect God to create through this manner, through laws, through the laws of nature?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure. You seem to be conflating a couple of things. Maybe I didn't understand your question. The laws of nature prove the existence of God. I don't think any physicist would. Most physicists are atheists anyway. They just say that's the way it is. If you want to invoke God as the source of the laws of nature, then you have to do that independently. Like, okay, show me evidence for God. But you were getting deeper into something about morality.
Well, yeah. I mean, maybe I'm talking over myself, but what I'm getting at is, you mentioned earlier that why would God create through this way, this way? And what I'm saying is, why wouldn't we expect God to create through that way, through laws, through natural laws? Why would we expect him to create through some way outside of those laws? Because if he didn't create through that way, then we couldn't have morality. Or why would we expect him to be a moral God?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are tribes that believe in immoral gods. I mean, the Greeks had a view of some of the gods were bad gods, and even some of the Hindus think that. If you say, well, it's obvious to any thinking person that God would create through natural laws, and therefore that through evolution, which is the working out of the natural laws, then I'd say, well, why did it take smart people 2,000 years to figure that out? Well, you know, they only figured it out when Darwin, who was pretty much of a non-believer himself, showed that evolution was true. Then they went back and did what you did, which is rationalize, well, of course God would have done it that way, because he would have worked out for physical laws. But then you have to tell me, well, you could say, well, why would God not do it that way? I would say, well, if God was like a magician, as he was in Genesis, why wouldn't he just create everything de novo? Why would he go through 3.5 billion years of this torturous process to get to the creature made in his own image? I mean, what's the purpose of that, you know? Why did God have to adhere to physical law? Because he's above physical law. So why did he have to use physical laws to make evolution work when he could have done otherwise? Because remember, God can do anything. So, you know, again, we arrive at this impasse about what methods would or would not have been used for God. In terms of morality, you know, morality to me is just a result of the fact that two things, that we're evolved creatures, that we evolved in small social groups of about 24 people, and we had to figure out ways to get along with each other. And we also had to evolve ways to get along with each other, because if we didn't, you know, those individuals that didn't fit in with their tribe they'd be kicked out. So to me, morality is almost an inevitable result. And in fact, we see it in our relatives, not only in primates like rhesus monkeys, but in crows and other animals as well, rudimentary morality, which shows that it could have evolved and partly been cultural.
There's time for one more question.
All right.
Yes, I just want to say first that I'm a personal friend of Francis Collins, and his life, my life, basically tracks his life. And when I was in college, I was a Bible major, but I was a Bertrand Russell at night. I'm wondering if you think that you're in question or pushing back on me. In other words, I have both of your books. I have also first editions of Darwin and Huxley and Universities of Fighting over the Mass, since I'm about to die. But you are aware that Darwin was not an atheist, and you are aware that Huxley was not an atheist.
Well, no, I'm not aware of that, actually. With somebody like Darwin and Huxley, or even Jefferson, back in history, if you said you're an atheist, you're in big trouble. So people who are non-believers, and for somebody like Huxley, he called himself an agnostic. Yeah. He was the guy, you know, he coined the term agnostic. He didn't believe in any kind of personal God. Darwin, it's not clear, but Darwin, he never went to church. he said his researches, as he wrote, led him to believe that how could a just, beneficent God do all this horrible stuff with natural selection? One gets the impression that he was pretty much of a non-believer, but his wife was religious, his milieu was religious. He couldn't, and Darwin was very aware that if he said he was an atheist, his theory was going to be rejected. So, you know, a lot of the scientists that people say are religious, like Einstein, for example, they're always trotted out to say, well, look at these smart guys who are religious, so that means that God exists, you know. Well, if you look closer into Darwin, Huxley and Einstein, you'll find out that they aren't religious in any form of the conventional sense of religion, as were our forefathers, the founders of this country. There's a book by one of your lawyers coming out,
Andrew Seidel.
Andrew Seidel, which it's not yet come out, but I'd recommend it highly. I read it, showing that the founding fathers of America were about as agnostic as you could get back then. Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, John Stuart Mill, people like that. So the lesson of that is that just like evolution is not a Christian theory, the USA is not a Christian country, despite what the Republicans tell you. So.
Let's thank Dan and Jerry for